Hey, so this is a challenging assignment, and we're going to dig through it and walk through all the issues and try to explain everything. And then hopefully our distance learning continues to progress as we all figure out what we're doing. So I want to talk about these in bunches. So let's talk about number 1 and 2 first, because both of these are calling the one arg constructor thingy. One passes a 1 into it, and the other one passes a 2 into it. Let's address the right side first of all. For the second one, we have this NA here in the answer for A. And so let's talk about what's going on. So the purpose of the NA is supposed to be saying, hey, that field is not available. So if we look at the declarations of the variables, T1 and T2 down here, we'll notice that T1 is an object while T2 is a thingy. And something of type T1, therefore will not have access to the field A. So that is what the reason why we have NA here. So the field does exist. We did create a thingy type object, but since we assigned it to just a T1 variable, which is of object type, we don't have access to it. Okay, so moving on, let's look at what gets printed out. So both of these call the one arg constructor, which would be right here. And then in that one arg constructor, they print out gy1 and set the value of A. And hence, we see both of them have the value gy1 printed out. You can ignore the double slash comments. Okay, moving on to the next batch, we have these thingamies. That's going to be number 3, 4, and 5. And let's talk about number 5 first, because it says it does not compile. And so this is going to be similar to number 2 that we just talked about. And so for this one, we are creating a thingamy, and we are trying to assign it to a thingamajig. A thingamajig is a subclass of thingamy, and so we can't create the superclass and assign it to a subclass because the thingamy is not a thingamajig. A thingamajig is a thingamy, but not the reverse. So this is where we get the does not compile error. Okay, let's return to number 3. And number 3 calls thingamy with 2 arguments. So we're going to enter in the 2 argument constructor, passing in A and B. The first thing that constructor does is calls the one arg constructor of its superclass, thingy. And so that's going to print out a gy1, and then set the value of A. That then returns back to where we came from. And then our thingamy constructor will continue, set the value of B, and then print out my2. So that's the reason why we have these 2 printouts. And then over on the right, we'll see the values 3 and 4. Okay, so for then number 4, this calls the no-arg constructor. So let's erase some of these things. Then we'll talk about the no-arg constructor. So we're going to call the no-arg constructor for thingamy. And so that's going to enter here. And the first thing that does is call this, which means it calls the 2-arg constructor in its own class. So it calls the other constructor. And then that guy in turn calls the superclass constructor as we just did. The superclass constructor prints out gy1. That then returns back down to the superclass constructor, which will set B and set print my2, which will then return back up to our original constructor and then print out my. So that's the reason why we get those 3 printouts this time. T2 is of type thingy, where we just created a thingamy. So T2 does not have access to the field B, so hence the reason why there's an NA here for 2. On to the next batch of 4. So we're going to look at the thingamajig constructors. So that's number 6 through 9. Number 1 is actually probably number 6, the first one, is probably the hardest of the bunch. Maybe 6 and 9. So look at number 6. It calls thingamajig with no arguments, right? So that is going to come up here. And if we recall, the first line of every constructor must be a call to its superclass constructor. So there is no call to the superclass constructor here, so the compiler puts it in for us. So it is going to call the no-arg superclass constructor of thingamajig, so that is going to jump over here. And now this continues very similarly to what we saw for a previous one. This then calls this constructor, so it's going to jump down here. which will in turn call its superclass constructor with one argument. So in the end, we're going to set the values of -1 for A and -2 for B, and we'll print out a variety of values, gy1, followed by my2, followed by my, followed by jig. The only catch now is, well, what's the value of C? Well, we never explicitly set it, and so since we didn't explicitly set it, the C up here defaults to 0. So if we look at the output over here, we'll see that the values are -1, -2, and 0. And for reasons that we explained before, since this is a T2, which is a higher type object of type thingy, it doesn't have access to the B and C variables. That's why those are listed as NA. For the next one, number 7, we call a 2-arg constructor. Right, we want to pass 2 arguments into the constructor. But if we look at the constructors over here, we have a no-arg constructor, we have 1-arg constructor, and we have a 3-arg constructor. A 2-arg constructor does not exist, so that's the reason why this would not compile. Let's look at number 8. So number 8 calls thingamajig with 3 arguments, so that's going to come right over here. The 3 arguments constructor calls the superclass 2-arg constructor, so that's going to come this way. And then the pattern is going to be very similar to what we've seen previously. The 2-arg constructor then calls the superclass 1-arg constructor, which will print out the gy1. That will then, of course, come back to here. It'll print out the my2, which will then return over, and it'll set the value of C and print out the jig3. For number 4, so now in this case let's just erase this. Okay, so number 4, we are calling the 1-arg constructor, which will come up here. The 1-arg constructor is up here. And then the 1-arg constructor calls the 3-arg constructor. And then the pattern is the same as before. The 3-arg constructor calls the superclass 2-arg constructor, which in turn calls the thingy 1-arg constructor. So you end up, it's a very similar answer between 8 and 9. We're just adding the extra jig1 at the end. Okay, then finally, let's talk about number 10. In number 10, we are instantiating a thing object, which extends a thingamajig, and we're calling the no-arg constructor. But interestingly, we say for a thing that there are no constructors. Well, if we recall, the compiler will add a no-arg constructor for us if we do not want to put one in. So this is going to call the no-arg constructor here that exists, put in by the compiler, and that no-arg constructor will have one line in it which calls the superclass no-arg constructor. So that will end up calling this guy jig. Now this guy does not have a super called a super, but that is required of all constructors. So since there was not one in, it will call the superclass no-arg constructor coming over to thingamy. Now in thingamy, that will then call this 2-arg constructor, so it's going to jump down here, which will then call the superclass 1-arg constructor. So we end up with a whole bunch of things that are going to print out: the gy1, followed by the my2, followed by the my, followed by the jig. So hopefully this explanation helped, and we can continue talking about these and practicing these in the days to come.